Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Liliana Valvano here. I'll be facilitating today. Welcome to Geographies of Queer and Uneven Development. We have three speakers. I'm going to read their bios and only the first sentence of their lovely bios. You can go on the conference website and read the rest of the bios. So Tianyi is our first speaker. Tianyi they them ha, is a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at Boston University. Tianyi is interested in transgender and queer studies and inter-Asian queer culture in general, and Chinese trans queer lifeways in particular. So I'm going to go through all of our bios in order. Roger Lancaster is a professor of anthropology and cultural studies at George Mason University. His research tries to understand how sexual mores, racial hierarchies, and class predicaments interact in a volatile world. And Alex Novitskaya teaches gender, women's, and sexuality studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She holds a PhD in women's, gender, and sexuality studies from Stony Brook University. Her research interests include queer migration and asylum, and post-Soviet politics and geopolitics of gender and sexuality. So those are our three speakers, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. Okay, we'll hand it over to you, sir.
Thanks for being this mic. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, perfect. I don't know much about tech stuff, but as long as y'all can hear me, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming to this presentation, and my presentation will mostly be about stories that I have encountered or experienced during my fieldwork in these recent 4 years. So I want to start my presentation with two persons that I met during my fieldwork in a coastal city in China in 2024. So there is this person named Ye, who worked at an NGO focused on cisgender gay and lesbian advocacy. And they identify as non-binary, so Korean in Mandarin Chinese. And it's primarily because that they could not fit into mainstream cis lesbian culture that really they say restrict them because of different kind of strict feminine gender roles. So yeah, use this non-binary label mostly when meeting with people who are themselves gender non-conforming. And then another person was Wei. So they are a freelance makeup artist who migrated to the coastal city from northern China. They also identify as Aryan, the non-binary term in Mandarin Chinese. And they used this term because they couldn't feel at ease with their assigned sex as at birth. But also because of their deeply internalized transmisogyny, they also feel like they could never be woman enough because of their lack of uterus. So we also reject the identity trans woman and lens on non-binary instead. So as we can see, even though those two persons uses the same term to describe their identity, they really have vastly different embodied experiences regarding this term in particular, and also gender in general. So in this paper and in this presentation, I'm really interested in unpacking how variant this Chinese term circulates as both logic and an identity in China, and how it opened up possibilities for people like Ye and Wei, and how at the same time it really quickly gets flattened into yet another fixed category that closes those possibilities back down. So to lay out the terminological ground a little bit in the context of current China, we have a term 外性别, which is literally trans plus gender, as the most formal and medically recognized category for trans people. We also have another term, queer, which emerged in the late tense in NGO circles as a broader umbrella term, which is roughly similar to trans used like very inclusively. So it was popularized to include those, not only those who transition between binary genders and also those who don't. And then variant, the term for non-binary, emerged much later, and it was roughly around 2015 that this term became popular. So to understand how variant emerges, I want to take us back to the genealogy of 性别, a term that roughly means gender or sex difference in Chinese, but also carries layers that neither the English term gender or sex fully captures. So in the 1990s, Chinese feminists like Wang Zheng introduced 社会性别, so social gender/sex difference. And she argued that what we call quote unquote women is not innate or biological, but produced. And her analysis is different a little bit from the West, where social gender also, or like the idea that gender is socially constructed, also became popular. Her ideas are different, particularly because she focused on this particular aspect of Chinese modernization. So she was arguing that this term women reflects China's anxious pursuit of modernity. So in other words, Wang Zheng argued that women became a site of potential development where a kind of teleological progress can be achieved. And feminist separation of social gender from biological gender/sex constitutes both a response and a proposed solution to specific invocation of quote-unquote women that emerged as the Chinese state struggled to recognize. So this separation of social and biological became popular, and then later it lays the ground for later justifications of transness, or specifically gender-affirming surgery technologies, or gender-reassignment surgery technologies in their own terms. And the most striking example that I talked about in the paper is this book called Correcting God's Mistake by Liliana. It was published in 2005. And this book documents a gender reassignment surgeon's achievement in China. And the author of the book used the analytical distinction between biological sex and psychological gender to sympathize with the trans people in the book, and talk about those people as those who were tragically born into the wrong body. So that narrative became really popular in China as well. And then, as we can see, transness in this framing is made into an individual and private conflict between one's own body and one's own mind. And also in this book, crucially, it was framed as, or transness, this whole thing is framed as something harmless to society because it was understood as the trans individual's inner psychological conflict. And it is in this genealogy that trans recognition became possible, was made possible. But as I just said, it really fits trans experience into a very narrow and individualized and medically legible mode. And of course, once recognized, trans subjects has to inform their chosen gender correctly, following the kind of binary norms. So this that I just talked about is the genealogy of gender/sex that this emerging term variant or non-binary is working against, and also to some extent working with it. This demand for fixed legible gender that structured a large part of trans recognition in China, or at least in the medical realm, is precisely what non-binariness tries to escape. And for in the paper, I also draw from work by people like Patricio and Kajian to show that using social gender, that's Patricio's work, or non-binary as an identity, that's Anna's work, as solution to normative constraints of gender and sex, would flatten or vertical queering possibilities of what gender would be, and also ignores the materialities of gender itself. So in this paper, I trace this genealogy, and I also want to throw from my fieldwork that this emerging term variant only really opened up such a limited space for individuals to explore and make sense of their gender. So I'm gonna talk about two stories, and hopefully that's more interesting than like the historical genealogies. The first story actually has to do with myself. That was at the pretty early on stages of my fieldwork. I was just there in like for like 2 months, and I was having lunch with two staff members at a cisgender gay-centered NGO. And the staff members, one is a cis lesbian, and one is a cis gay. So we were having lunch, and they were talking about all the bullies that they had experienced by being gay growing up. And then, well, I was just like eating my lunch, minding my own business. And then suddenly, one of them, the lesbian person, turned to me and asked, "Are you homosexual?" And I was like, I was a little bit surprised by the question. So I tried to explain. I was like, I think I'm pansexual, and I've always experienced gender as this fluid thing that I feel like I exist somehow outside of the binary, so the term homosexual never really quite made sense to me. And then the staff member's response was really immediate. She said, "Pansexual doesn't count. You haven't experienced the discrimination that we have." And then after a pause, she asked me, "What do you identify as when you date someone? Your partner has to know whether you're a man or a woman, right?" So that question needs a little bit unpacking. So singular or gender slash sex is not fixed by biology, but it has to be a single choice of either man or woman. So she could easily accept that gender can be changed. It is possible, but again, it has to land somewhere that's really stable and legible. Because for her, in this advocacy group, legibility is what makes identity publicizable. And that translation of something here into publicly intelligible ideas is exactly what her advocacy was built on. So for me at the time, to get out of this conversation, I did something strategic. So I explained this non-binary mess as a new identity category, as either or neither nor of the classic binary situation. And I told her that this new category is gaining recognition, it's becoming more and more of a legitimate category. And she very easily accepted it, and then started asking questions to me. But now thinking about it later, I realized that I had really translated the binary breaking logic of variant into exactly the kind of fixed identity that is supposed to exist. I made it legible by making it stable. And the radical potential of this super quick encounter was traded by me for social intelligibility. And then the second story I'm going to tell is a little bit more complicated. So during my fieldwork, also sort of in the early stages, I attended a dinner event organized by a local activist to welcome two trans men activists from Taiwan. And this event drew 11 people, and 7 of them were broadly trans identified. And among the 7, the identity markers that emerged in some introductions included 跨性别男性 transgender men, variant, non-binary term, and then Demi Boy studying English, and then Kwasing the same thing. So that's transgender, third gender, and it was set together by a person. And the Chinese activists were really confused about the last two, the Demi Boy and the transgender third gender. So in this presentation, I want to talk about a very specific moment that occurred. So me, the person who identified as Demi Boy, as they were trying to explain what this means, they pull out their phone and show the group a gender spectrum diagram. It's like a gender coin thing. I don't know if any of you have encountered it, but like it's a cool diagram. So Ming explained why they had moved away from the term trans men and towards the trans people. And then Ming asked Yuan, the person, the older and much respected local activist who identified as transgender third gender. So Ming asked Yuan if they have identified this term, if they had known the term, and if they had. And Yuan said that they were not caught up in those new terms. So that was some newness. And then they traced their own journey, saying that they first used the term and then encountered different accounts, and then eventually settled on third gender about a decade ago. And then the Taiwanese activists similarly brushed off their unfamiliarity of those terms by calling those terms new. So here I want to draw attention to the invocation of newness in their conversations. According to Yuan, and probably we, for those of us who are familiar with the emergence and histories of the terms, Yuan's term was not new. It was there for like, as Yuan said, at least a decade ago. And this invocation of newness is not simply about the phonological emergence terms, but I suggest that it resonates with the emergence of queer theory in China as a blueprint of liberation that is imagined to, it can be achieved through societal progress. It's imagined as such. So this reading of queerness shaped the authoritative power of transgender terms newness. So the newer terms are the more progress it's imagined to be. So that's how those activists were exchanging and interacting with the newness terms. And again, while those newer terms seek to break away from the liminal binary logic of genders, its queering potential was then quickly complicated by this assumed teleology of this. So towards the end of my presentation, I want to return to the two persons that I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah, right. So in the past years, yeah, because it was in 2024, so in the past 2 years, yeah, the NGO person kept working on NGO, and they've been supporting non-trans lesbians while being daily misgendered as cis lesbian. And then Wig underwent breast augmentation surgery, and in their own words, it gave up the privilege of moving fluidly between being bred as a man or woman, because right now they are constantly being bred as women with their surgery. And both Ida and Wei have made choices to express or not express themselves in ways that allow them to better navigate this daily gender profiling that's imposed by cis-normative worlds. But neither choices resolve their tension with. So in this paper, I argued that, well, variant, this non-binary term, creates an initial space for articulating genders beyond the binary, its rapid stabilization into a fixed identity category ultimately limits its potential to disrupt normative gender expectations. And I argue that this swift consolidation reflects not only the constraints of Chinese socio-historical context, but also a broader desire among local individuals to quote unquote catch up with global queer vocabularies. So, in other words, my paper was about how this term looks get fixed, get contested, and keeps moving as local actors in China actively shape this kind of transnational conversations and produce it.
What's that?
I'll stand.
Okay,
Thank you.
back up to me.
I hope my voice holds.
This is mostly so they can hear you on the streaming.
Yes, okay, very good. Starting my timer. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for turning out on a sunny, lovely Saturday afternoon to hear academic presentations. So 30 years ago, the gay historian Alan Barabay observed a connection between economic polarization in the neoliberal era and the rise of academic queer theory. He had joined an academic audience, much like this one, to pay closer attention to social class, to make it central to our analytical frameworks. We mostly did no such thing, and we mostly still do not. But his challenge bears repeating. It has become more urgent with the passage of time and the obvious deterioration of social conditions. My recent book takes up the call, and my paper today is a series of outtakes and arguments, provocations, really. The book is The Struggle to be Gay in Mexico, for example, came out last year. The Spanish translation will come out this year. In Mexico, the relationship between sexual identity and class position is no secret. People tell and retell a joke that succinctly captures the nature of this relationship. So I'll play out the joke and you'll see where it goes. Father, begins an earnest young man from a working class barrio. I have something to tell you. I'm gay. My son, the father replies, I didn't know. But let me ask you a few questions. I'm trying to understand this. Do you shop at high-end boutiques and wear name-brand clothing? Do you rent an apartment in the fashionable part of town? Can you even get into posh clubs that charge 500 pesos at the door? Now, expert raconteurs will play this out with various inflections and minor variations. And the boy's answer to all three questions is in sequences, basically, why, no, Papa, you know I can't afford such things. Then comes the punchline. The father's flat-footed response to the boy's earnest self-disclosure. Well, my son, I love you very much. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're confused. You're mistaken. Somebody knows the joke. No eres gay. Eres solo un pinche puto. You're not gay. You're just a fucking fag. Succinctly captures the logic of something very pervasive in Mexico. The ubiquitous joke gives us a rather straightforward description of the material obstacles that stand in the way of the young aspirant's path to a modern destigmatized identity. It tells us in so many words that being poor, working class, or even lower middle class makes it extremely difficult to claim a gay identity or to assert membership in a modern gay community. If we add that these difficulties multiply for dark-skinned, indigenous, and rural queers, for manual laborers, and for recent immigrants to the city, we say the obvious, but we are also saying essentially the same thing. Gay is understood to be an affluent, cosmopolitan, up-to-date, modern identity. Putos are all those who come up short. Rustics, poor people, indigenous people, anyone without money in his pocket, that is to say, the broadly defined working class. It is thus the inevitability of being a puto that confronts our hapless protagonist. So what if we take the father's words literally? He tells us first how class limits and steers the boy's options by way of brute economic logic, limited resources. Then, consequently, how class dynamics mark social spaces and structure symbolic worlds, coding gay as cosmopolitan, modern, middle class, and so on. And finally, how these conditions consign the boy to the role of an unhappy aspirant. Now, in the published chapter, I detail some of the ways working class people attempt to display the desired identity. Their attempts frequently come down to inauthentic performances and failed attempts at staging cosmopolitanism. Fake designer labels purchased on the black market figure prominently in these versions. Such sham performances and the scripts on which they are based are scarcely unheard of in the US or other countries, but they do have a specific political economic placement in Mexico. I nod at the theme of this general session here. The sorts of status marking commodities that display gay identity are closely connected with trade liberalization and the dissolution of the closed, protected national market that had clothed, shod, and equipped Mexicans for decades under the import substitution regime. That is, with the opening of the economy to US and other international name brands associated with wealth, cosmopolitanism, and savvy. Gayness, arguably, was one of these imports, conceptually displacing and reorganizing homosexual subcultures in Mexico. Now, the distinctions tracked in sexual cultures are not unrelated to those mapped in wider society. This general template is applicable in a number of other instances. These distinctions invariably take in colonial histories, traditional forms of domination, and modern capitalist relations. Raiment, coiffure, accessories, all the commodities and services that go into a person's look, an English term that has also mysteriously entered into the local domain, right? These are important because appearances is where the strands of inequality come together, reveal themselves, or unravel. So I want to think a bit about appearances then. In parsing how this works, we might be tempted to give an intersectional account, where pre-given identities overlap and everything weighs roughly the same as everything else. But class is not the same as the other elements in the sequence. Class is not an effect of classism, a confused concept modeled on racism and sexism, which views economic inequality through the lens of discrimination. Rather, class is economic power, full stop, which exists independently of any fakery or discriminatory intent. Above all, we need to understand then how ethnic, racial, sexual, and so on identities take shape at political economic conjunctures within the class condition of society. Let me illustrate by examining some forms of everyday discrimination based on appearances. And I nod at our previous presenter because I'm going to tell stories and jokes, and it'll be a storytelling exercise to some extent. Eric A young working class gay man recounts the story of how he and two straight friends had been refused entry into one of Puebla's upscale clubs. Like other establishments along the Avenida Juarez, the straight club posted notice of a non-discriminatory policy at the door. You see these everywhere in Mexico now. In this establishment, we do not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic condition, tattoos, or for any other, and tattoos is usually on the list, by the way, or for any other reason. The bouncer was polite, but told the group that this was a private club with admission by membership or invitation. Now, this is an old trick everywhere, isn't it? Clubs keep out people deemed undesirable by citing membership policies. But Eric could see that people were entering and without presenting any membership cards. So he asked a pair of well-dressed, lighter-skinned strangers if his group could enter with them. The pair assented, and the bouncer relented. Eric also reports how, later that evening, from inside a bathroom stall, he could overhear the conversation of his group's sponsors. Who were those Indians, and what pueblo did they come from? Now, I have never heard of anyone being denied entry to a gay club based on appearances or presumed ethnic identity and so on and so on. I really haven't. So the gay clubs are maybe more open and tolerant than straight clubs are. But surmises made at a glance about a person's material condition, his class, ethnicity, the relative proportions of his mixed ethnic origins certainly do happen in gay settings. Put-downs, jests, and insults frequently refer to the colonial history marked on a person's face. One informant is a middle-class professional whose skin is dark. He relates how, when he tapped a prospect on Grindr, the object of his interests curtly rebuffed his attention and called him Pinche Indio de mierda, shitty, worthless Indian. Racist slurs of this general sort provide the backdrop for commonplace banter and squabbling in interpersonal relations. Indeed, so frequent were my acquaintances' complaints about everyday insults based on complexion that I began asking them, do you feel more oppressed because of your class position or because of your skin color? And I really wondered, as I overheard conversations and the trading of insults, it seemed to me that I had almost expected my subjects to say that in practice they were much the same thing. One scarcely need conduct large-scale survey sample to see that darker-skinned Mexicans tend to be poorer, lighter-skinned Mexicans tend to be more affluent. There's a very strong correlation. But to a person, every one of my working class informants said that class weighed more heavily in his everyday experiences of privation and insult. Eric laid out his response most clearly. Look, if I had money, I'd dress the part. I'd pull up in a fancy car. It's unlikely that some poorly paid bouncer would give me grief over the color of my skin. And even if he did, what's it to me? I'd complain to the manager, or I'd wave some money around, or I'd buy something. That is to say, my working class acquaintances viewed money as the great solvent of prejudice, even if they acknowledged the inevitability of being viewed as indigenous. They also understood, thus, the difference between class, which is real, and classism, which is an extension of class, a kind of prejudice that adheres to the surface of class. Darker-skinned middle-class informants, by contrast, tended to weigh color discriminations more heavily in the scheme of things. Slights and brushes involving presumed ethnic origins could loom larger among their concerns precisely because brute economic privation had been taken out of the picture for them. Now, the kinds of color discrimination that I am talking about here are very different from the kinds of animus that structure racism in the United States. They sound similar, but the former occur among mestizo and mixed race people, a large majority of Mexicans, whereas the latter occur between corporate races, legally defined groups whose status is ascribed on birth certificates, official paperwork, and census data. Still, we might draw out some broad parallels. Adolph Reed has written extensively about the class basis for contemporary anti-racist politics in the United States at a time of intensifying economic inequalities that cut across class lines. On his accounting, many variants of professional anti-racism are driven by members of the professional managerial middle classes who feel the sting of racial animus, but not of class exploitation. And for Reed, this is key, who build representational strategies that serve as alternative to broad multi-ethnic working class politics. In a US context, then, Grant Ferred succinctly, although perhaps inadvertently, demonstrates the salience of class in his description of the incident that motivated him to write a short philosophical treatise, Martin Heidegger Saved My Life. The South African-born Black philosopher was raking leaves outside his spacious home in Ithaca, dressed down for the part. An apparently white woman passing by mistook him for hired help and asked, "Would you like another job?" Now, this incident might have prodded a series of deep reflections about the relationship between class and race, and how class provides the underpinnings for race in the modern world, and how class gives the gravitational field on which other identities like sexuality or race or ethnicity can take shape. And Ferred is not oblivious to social class, far from it. He begins his disquisition by talking about his working class origins. But instead, he retorted to the old woman, "Only if you can match my Cornell faculty salary." That is to say, the academic puts the woman who is presumably not an Ivy League professor in her place and asserts the real hierarchy based on income and cultural capital. Although the inevitability of being viewed as a manual laborer still stings enough that he was motivated to unpack the encounter with a short, ruminating academic text. So, was Eric's group initially rebuffed because of the way its members were dressed or because of their skin color? Was it classism, an effective class, or was it racism? More likely than not, it was the way all of these come together, the way one invoked the other. For people look at obvious and subtle cues to make surmises at a glance. Appearances in the aggregate thus gauge a person's ethnic origins, his relationship to modernity, his savvy about fashion trends, and above all, his class standing. Sometimes the signs of class, status, and power might set up a struggle among themselves in the visage, on the corpus, in politics. But in the end, when people strive to present a modern, affluent image to the world, their options are ultimately limited by their purchasing power. In other words, by class. The Mexican joke's father is being vulgar. He's being mean. But he's also being a materialist in the strictest sense of the word. In that spirit, I conclude with a joke, or better yet, a vignette, which also serves as a challenge at a time when the world is on fire and democracy is coming apart at the seams. All right, so A white gay, a black trans woman, and a straight male Latino walk into a bar. Yeah, all right. So it's the best I could do. I'm a storyteller, not a joke writer, but and you have to imagine that they work in the service industry or in construction. And true to contemporary academic form, their initial conversation gradually turns into statements of difference. How could you possibly understand what my life is like? But the Mexican father, who has been sitting unnoticed down the bar nursing a beer, leans over and interrupts. He says, "You have all been here arguing about identity, but can any one of you afford the cover charge?" Recognizing the joke, the group laughs. See, it wasn't as good a punchline as I thought it would be. Nobody laughed. But the group laughs and the conversation progresses. It becomes clear that they do share a lot of things in common. Rents that strain the pocketbook, paychecks that run out before the end of the month, arbitrary bosses under at-will employment, rising healthcare costs, and the insecurities associated with them. They also want many of the same things: stability, connection, love, some relief from the monotony of the workaday world. And each confronts, in his or her own way, the inevitability of being singled out for slights and injuries, especially as they face the world without the protection and money.